Winter in Illinois, 1932. The Great Depression had left its mark on every corner of America, but the old O'Connor mansion stood unchanged on the outskirts of Springfield, defiant against time and economic collapse. Margaret O'Connor, a slender woman of 35 with auburn hair and tired eyes, stood at the entrance of her family home, key in hand, hesitant to enter. Her uncle Seamus had passed away 3 weeks prior, leaving her as the sole heir to the O'Connor estate. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of mothballs and furniture polish. The family lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, followed closely behind her, his leather briefcase clutched tightly in his gloved hands. "I haven't been here since I was a child," Margaret said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Uncle Seamus never invited anyone after my parents died." "Your uncle was a private man," Mr. Abernathy replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Peculiar, some might say. But he was adamant that everything should go to you." Margaret's gaze was drawn to the main hallway where a series of portraits hung in ornate frames. Family members from different eras stared back at her with stern expressions, their eyes seeming to follow her movements. At the end of the row hung a new portrait, one she hadn't seen before. Even from a distance she recognized her Uncle Seamus. "That's strange," she murmured, moving closer to examine it. "I don't recall Uncle Seamus ever sitting for a portrait." Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "Perhaps he commissioned it before his passing?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, that can't be right. This looks recent, but he was bedridden for months before he died." She studied the painting more carefully. Her uncle appeared healthier than he had in years, his posture straight, his face fuller. Yet something about his eyes unsettled her. They held a warning. "Mrs. O'Connor, I have some documents for you to sign," Mr. Abernathy interrupted her thoughts. "And there's the matter of the staff." "Staff? I thought Uncle Seamus lived alone." "There's only the housekeeper, Mrs. Callahan. She's been with the family for decades. She lives in the cottage behind the garden." After signing the necessary papers, Margaret was left alone in the house. As twilight descended, she wandered through the rooms, memories of childhood visits resurfacing. In the study, she found old photographs, letters, and family records. Among them was a leather-bound journal belonging to her grandmother, Elizabeth O'Connor. Settling into a dusty armchair, Margaret opened the journal and began to read. Most entries were mundane accounts of daily life until she reached an entry from 1887. Another portrait has appeared. This time it's Jonathan. The likeness is uncanny, though he's been dead 3 days. No one in the family ever mentions them, but we all know. The O'Connors never buy portraits, they simply appear when someone dies. I fear what mine will reveal when my time comes. Margaret closed the journal, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty old house. She looked up at the family portraits on the wall, seeing them with new eyes. Each one, she realized with growing unease, must have appeared shortly after that family member's death. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Margaret decided she would spend the night and begin sorting through her uncle's belongings in the morning. As she climbed the stairs to find a bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in every portrait were watching her, guarding a family secret she was only beginning to uncover. The next morning, Margaret was awakened by a gentle knocking at her bedroom door. She opened her eyes to find herself in her childhood bedroom, untouched since her last visit nearly 20 years ago. For a moment, she forgot where she was before the memories of yesterday came flooding back. "Mrs. O'Connor, are you awake?" called a voice from the hallway. Margaret wrapped herself in a robe and opened the door to find an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was deeply lined, but her blue eyes were sharp and alert. "Mrs. Callahan, I presume?" Margaret asked. The housekeeper nodded. "I've prepared breakfast downstairs. We have much to discuss." In the dining room, Margaret found a modest spread of eggs, toast, and coffee. Mrs. Callahan remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her apron. "I understand you've inherited the house," the housekeeper said. "Will you be staying long?" "I haven't decided yet," Margaret replied, sipping her coffee. "I need to go through Uncle Seamus's belongings and decide what to do with the property." Mrs. Callahan's expression tightened. "There are things about this house, about your family, that you should know." "Like the portraits?" Margaret asked directly. The old woman's eyes widened slightly. "So you've noticed." "I found my grandmother's journal. She mentioned that the O'Connors never buy portraits, that they just appear when someone dies. Is that true?" Mrs. Callahan lowered herself into a chair across from Margaret. "I've worked for your family since I was 16 years old. I've seen 4 generations of O'Connors come and go, and with each death, a new portrait appears on the wall within days. No one commissions them, no artist delivers them, they simply materialize." "That's impossible," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Many have tried to remove them," Mrs. Callahan continued as if she hadn't heard. Your great-grandfather attempted to burn his wife's portrait after she passed. The next morning it was back on the wall, untouched. Your uncle tried to sell some of them years ago, but the buyers returned them, claiming the paintings had vanished from their homes and reappeared here. Margaret pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. And no one knows why this happens. There are theories, Mrs. Callahan said, lowering her voice. Some say it's a curse dating back to your ancestors in Ireland. Others believe the house itself is possessive of the family's memory. And what do you believe, Mrs. Callahan? The housekeeper hesitated. I believe the portraits serve a purpose. They watch, they wait, they ... remember. A chill ran through Margaret. Remember what? That's not for me to say, Mrs. Callahan replied, standing abruptly. But I'd advise you not to stay in this house too long, Mrs. O'Connor. Nothing good comes to those who linger here. She began clearing the dishes. Oh, and one more thing. Don't enter the attic. Your uncle forbade it, and for good reason. After breakfast, Margaret decided to explore the house more thoroughly. She found herself drawn back to the portrait gallery in the main hallway. Now counting them, she realized there were 23 portraits spanning from the mid-1800s to the present. Each subject was painted in the style of their era, but there was a consistency to them that suggested a single artist. At the end of the hall was a door she hadn't noticed before. It was locked, but a quick search through the key ring, Mr. Abernethy had given her yielded a small brass key that fit perfectly. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading up to what she assumed was the attic, the very place Mrs. Callahan had warned her against. Curiosity overcoming caution, Margaret began to climb the stairs. The attic stairs creaked with each step Margaret took, the wood protesting beneath her weight as if trying to warn her away. The air grew increasingly stale as she ascended, carrying the scent of old paper and forgotten things. At the top, she found another locked door, smaller than the one below. None of her keys seemed to fit. Frustrated but determined, Margaret returned downstairs to search for the key. In her uncle's study, she methodically went through drawers and boxes until she found a small iron key hanging on a hook inside a hidden compartment of his desk. Back at the attic door, the key turned with difficulty, the lock mechanism stiff from disuse. When the door finally swung open, Margaret was met with darkness. She fumbled for a light switch, finding none, then remembered the flashlight she had seen in the kitchen drawer. After retrieving it, she returned and directed its beam into the attic space. What she saw made her gasp. The attic was an artist's studio. Easels were positioned near the dormer windows where natural light would stream in during the day. Paint-splattered drop cloths covered the floor, and shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of pigments, brushes, and canvases in various stages of completion. But what truly caught her attention was the large, unfinished portrait in the center of the room. The subject was unmistakable. It was her. The painting captured her features perfectly. The slight asymmetry of her eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall, even the streak of premature gray in her hair that she usually kept colored. Yet the background remained blank, the setting undetermined. Margaret's hands trembled as she examined the portrait. How could this exist when she had never posed for it? The paint was still tacky in places, suggesting recent work. This isn't possible, she whispered to herself. Her flashlight beam revealed more disturbing details. On a work table lay newspaper clippings about O'Connor family deaths dating back decades. Beside them was a leather-bound book similar to her grandmother's journal. She picked it up and opened it to find it was a ledger. With names and dates meticulously recorded, deaths of family members matched with completion dates of their portraits. The most recent entry read, Seamus O'Connor, deceased November 12, 1932. Portrait completed November 5, 10th, 1932. Below it was another entry, written in the same precise handwriting, Margaret O'Connor. Portrait commenced November 30th, 1932. Yesterday's date. Margaret dropped the book as if it had burned her. She backed away, bumping into something solid behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with a full-length mirror draped in black cloth. Compelled by a morbid curiosity, she pulled the cloth away. In the mirror's reflection, she saw herself, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a figure in shadow, hands poised as if holding an invisible paintbrush. Margaret spun around, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Heart racing, she gathered the ledger and hurried downstairs, slamming the attic door behind her. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Mrs. Callahan. You went to the attic, the housekeeper stated flatly, her eyes falling on the ledger in Margaret's hands. What is happening in this house? Margaret demanded. There's a portrait of me up there, unfinished. Dan, this book, ... She held up the ledger. It says my portrait was started yesterday. How is that possible? Mrs. Callahan's expression softened with what looked like pity. I warned you not to go up there. The attic is where they're created. Created by whom? Who's painting these portraits? That's the question every O'Connor's asked, Mrs. Callahan replied. Some say it's the house itself. Others believe it's the spirits of those who've passed, ensuring they're not forgotten. She paused. Your uncle had his own theory. He believed that in this family, death itself is the artist. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. That's superstitious nonsense. Perhaps Mrs. Callahan conceded. But consider this, in all my years with your family, I've never seen anyone enter or leave that attic besides an O'Connor. Yet the portraits appear, one after another, following each death. I need to leave this place, Margaret said, more to herself than to Mrs. Callahan. That would be wise, the housekeeper agreed. But know this, no O'Connor has ever escaped their portrait. Wherever you go, it will find its way to completion. That night, Margaret lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. The ledger sat on her nightstand, its presence a constant reminder of what she had discovered. Outside, a storm had blown in, rain lashing against the windows while thunder rumbled in the distance. She had packed her bags, ready to depart in the morning. But Mrs. Callahan's words echoed in her mind. No O'Connor has ever escaped their portrait. As lightning flashed, illuminating the room, Margaret caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. On the wall opposite her bed, where there had been nothing before, now hung a frame. It appeared empty in the darkness, but she knew better. Her portrait had moved from the attic and was one step closer to completion. Morning arrived with clearing skies and a deceptive calm. Margaret had barely slept, keeping watch on the empty frame that now hung on her bedroom wall. In the light of day, she could see that the canvas within was no longer blank. The background had been filled in overnight, depicting the very room in which she now stood. With trembling hands, she dressed quickly and descended to the dining room, where Mrs. Callahan was setting out breakfast. You look unwell, Mrs. O'Connor, the housekeeper observed. The portrait, Margaret said, her voice hoarse. It's in my room now, and it's changing, being painted somehow. Mrs. Callahan nodded gravely. They progress more quickly once they've chosen their place. I can't stay here. I'm leaving today. As you wish, Mrs. Callahan replied, though her tone suggested she doubted the effectiveness of Margaret's plan. After a hasty breakfast, Margaret went to her uncle's study to search for more information. If she was to understand what was happening and possibly find a way to stop it, she needed to learn everything she could about the family's history with these portraits. In a locked cabinet, she discovered a collection of family histories, correspondence, and legal documents dating back to the first O'Connor who had settled in Illinois in 1842. According to these records, Ian O'Connor had fled Ireland during the Great Famine, bringing with him little more than the clothes on his back and a peculiar talent for investment that quickly built him a fortune in America. What caught Margaret's attention was a letter dated 1849. From Ian to his brother still in Ireland, I have secured our family's prosperity through means that some might call unseemly. A painter, a strange fellow from the old country, offered me a bargain I could not refuse. Wealth and success for our line in exchange for what he called a canvas of remembrance upon each passing. I thought little of it then. What man concerns himself with how he'll be remembered after death? But now I wonder at the true nature of our arrangement, for when Mother passed last winter, her likeness appeared in my hall within days, though I commissioned no such work. The painter has not been seen since our agreement, yet his work continues. May God forgive me if I have bound our bloodline to something unholy. Margaret read the letter twice, then set it aside with shaking hands. So it had begun with a pack-day deal with a mysterious painter for the family's prosperity. But what exactly had Ian O'Connor agreed to? Further searching revealed more disturbing details. A journal entry from Ian's son, written in 1876. Father passed yesterday. This morning I found his portrait hanging where there had been only empty wall the night before. The likeness is perfect, but his eyes hold such sorrow, such regret. I am convinced now that these portraits are more than mere paintings. They capture something of the soul, and I fear that whatever bargain Father struck has imprisoned us all. As she continued through the family records, Margaret found repeated mentions of attempts to end the portrait phenomenon, paintings removed only to reappear, efforts to sell the house thwarted by financial reversals or sudden illnesses. Even a cousin who had tried to burn down the mansion in 1902, only to die in the fire, his portrait appearing 3 days later, showing him surrounded by flames. Most troubling was an account from her own grandfather, written just months before his death in 1915. I have spent my life researching our family's curse. What I have learned gives me no comfort. The painter with whom Ian made his devil's bargain was no ordinary man, but something older, something that has worn many faces throughout history. In exchange for our prosperity, it takes not just our likenesses but pieces of our essence. Each portrait completed strengthens its hold on this house on our bloodline. I believe it feeds on our deaths, collecting us one by one. May those who come after me find a way to break this chain. Margaret closed the journal, her mind racing. If her grandfather was right, then the portraits were more than a supernatural curiosity. They were a form of imprisonment, capturing something of each family member after death. And now her own portrait was being created. She gathered the most relevant documents, intending to take them with her when she left. As she was about to leave the study, her eye was caught by a small painting on the wall she hadn't noticed before. It showed the mansion as it must have looked when newly built, and standing before it was a thin man in dark clothing, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Something about his posture, the way his hands were positioned, reminded her of the shadowy figure she had glimpsed in the attic mirror. Suddenly, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Margaret felt a presence behind her and spun around, but there was no one there. Yet when she turned back to the small painting, she could have sworn the figure had moved slightly, his head now angled as if looking directly at her. A knock at the study door made her jump. It was Mrs. Callahan. "Your car has arrived, Mrs. O'Connor," the housekeeper announced. "Shall I tell the driver you'll be a few minutes?" "No," Margaret said firmly, gathering her documents and handbag. "I'm ready to leave now." As she followed Mrs. Callahan to the front door, Margaret couldn't help glancing at the portrait gallery in the main hallway. Her uncle's painting seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, as if aware of her plan to escape. Outside, the driver was loading her luggage into the car. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front lawn, and a sense of relief washed over Margaret as she prepared to leave the mansion behind. She turned to Mrs. Callahan, who stood in the doorway. "Will you be all right here alone?" Margaret asked. "I've been alone in this house many times," the housekeeper replied. "The question is, will you be all right where you're going?" Before Margaret could respond, the driver called that he was ready. With a final nod to Mrs. Callahan, she climbed into the car and directed the driver to take her to the train station in Springfield. From there she would travel to Chicago, and then she wasn't sure. Somewhere far from Illinois, somewhere the O'Connor legacy couldn't follow. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Margaret looked back through the rear window. For a moment she thought she saw a figure standing at her bedroom window watching her departure. But a blink later, there was nothing but empty glass reflecting the morning sky. The train journey to Chicago passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Margaret had chosen a private compartment, unwilling to make conversation with strangers while her mind was consumed with thoughts of portraits that painted themselves in family curses. Outside the window, the Illinois landscape rolled by barren winter fields and small towns struggling under the weight of the Depression. By the time she arrived in Chicago, evening was settling over the city. The streets were less crowded than she remembered from pre-crash visits, but still bustling with enough activity to make her feel anonymous and temporarily at least safe. She checked into the Palmer House, a luxury hotel that had somehow managed to maintain its elegance despite the economic downturn. In her suite, Margaret finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She ordered dinner from room service, then spread the family documents she had brought across the bed, determined to find some clue, some way to break the curse that seemed to follow the O'Connor bloodline. Hours passed as she pored over letters, journals, and legal papers. Her eyes grew tired, the words beginning to blur together. Just as she was about to give up for the night, a passage in one of her great-aunt's diaries caught her attention. "I met a woman today who claims to know something of our family's affliction. She says the portraits are anchors, binding the essence of each O'Connor to the house, to the land. The bargain cannot be broken while the bloodline continues, but she hinted that there might be a way to satisfy the terms without surrender. I must find her again, learn more." Unfortunately, the diary ended there, with no further mention of the mysterious woman or what she might have revealed. Margaret checked the date in '98 and sighed. Whatever knowledge her great-aunt had uncovered was likely lost to time. A knock at the door startled her. The hotel desk clerk stood in the hallway holding an envelope. "Telegram for you, Mrs. O'Connor," he said. "Just arrived." Margaret thanked him and closed the door before opening the envelope. The message was brief. "Your portrait progresses. Stop face taking shape. Stop return before completion or consequences will be dire. Stop Mrs. C." Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed, the telegram trembling in her hand. How had Mrs. Callahan known where to find her? She had told no one of her destination. And more importantly, how was the portrait continuing to develop when she was miles away from the mansion? Sleep eluded her that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the unfinished portrait, her own face emerging from the canvas, eyes hollow and waiting. Around 3 in the morning, she finally drifted into an uneasy slumber, only to be awakened by a sensation of being watched. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, she saw something on the wall opposite her bed, a rectangular shadow darker than the surrounding darkness. Heart pounding, Margaret fumbled for the bedside lamp. When light flooded the room, she found herself staring at an empty hotel wall, unmarked except for a faded floral pattern. Had she imagined it? The border of a frame? The suggestion of canvas? The next morning, Margaret decided to seek help. Among her mother's papers had been correspondence with a Professor Elliot Carter at the University of Chicago, discussing family legends and their historical basis. Perhaps he was still at the university and might have insight into her situation. A telephone call confirmed that Professor Carter was indeed still teaching, though now in his 70s. He agreed to meet her that afternoon. The university campus offered a welcome distraction from her fears. Students hurried between buildings, their faces young and untroubled by anything more supernatural than upcoming exams. Professor Carter's office was in an old stone building that housed the anthropology department. He greeted her warmly, a tall man with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss O'Connor, you're the spitting image of your mother. Please, have a seat." Once they were settled, Margaret hesitated, uncertain how to begin. How does one explain to a rational academic that one's family portraits paint themselves after death? "Professor Carter, how much did my mother tell you about our family traditions?" The old man's expression grew serious. "Your mother was researching what she called the O'Connor anomaly. She believed your family was experiencing a hereditary form of what the old folklorists would call a curse." He leaned forward. "She showed me photographs of the portrait gallery. Quite remarkable workmanship, if I recall." Encouraged by his matter-of-fact approach, Margaret explained everything, the portraits that appeared after deaths, her discovery in the attic, the family records describing the original bargain, and now her own portrait taking shape despite her absence from the mansion. Professor Carter listened without interruption, taking occasional notes. When she finished, he removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully. "The Irish have a rich tradition of bargains with the other world," he said finally. "Pacts with beings that aren't quite human, not quite spirit. In the old country, they were often associated with specific locations, a forest, a hill, a stone circle. When your ancestor came to America, it seems something came with him or perhaps followed, but what does it want?" Margaret asked, "Why the portraits?" "In folklore, such entities often seek to collect or preserve. Your family record mentions prosperity in exchange for a canvas of remembrance upon each passing. I suspect this being whatever it is, collects the essence of your family members through these portraits, anchoring them to the house as your great-aunt suggested. Can it be stopped?" Professor Carter hesitated. "Folklore suggests such bargains can sometimes be renegotiated, but rarely broken outright. The terms must be fulfilled, one way or another." "So I'm trapped," Margaret said bitterly. "Either return to the house and await my portrait's completion, or ... double quotes, not necessarily," the professor interjected. "Your great-aunt mentioned satisfying the terms without surrender. That suggests there might be an alternative." He rose and went to his bookshelf, selecting several volumes. "I need to consult some sources. Can you return tomorrow?" Margaret agreed, though her sense of urgency was growing. As she prepared to leave, Professor Carter stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "One more thing, Mrs. O'Connor. Have you noticed any changes in yourself since discovering the portrait?" The question caught her off guard. "Changes? What do you mean?" "Folklore suggests that such entities can influence those they've marked. Changes in behavior, unusual impulses, dreams of returning home." Margaret thought of her restless night, the sensation of being watched, the shadow on the wall. "Perhaps," she admitted, "but nothing I can't resist." The professor nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Be vigilant, Mrs. O'Connor, and whatever you do, don't return to that house until we've spoken again." Back at the hotel, Margaret found herself drawn to the window, looking north in the direction of Springfield and the O'Connor mansion beyond. A strange longing tugged at her, a desire to return that she recognized wasn't entirely her own. When she turned back to the room, she froze. On the wall where she had seen the shadow the night before now hung a small, ornate frame. Within it was the beginning of a painting, the hotel room rendered in perfect detail, though the subject was still just an outline. Her portrait had followed her to Chicago. Margaret spent a sleepless night with her back to the wall, keeping watch on the small framed canvas that had appeared in her hotel room. By morning, the outline of her figure in the portrait had become more defined, though her face remained blank. The painting was progressing more slowly than it had in the mansion, but it was progressing nonetheless. She left the hotel early, unwilling to stay in the room with the portrait any longer than necessary. The morning was cold. a light snow falling over Chicago as she made her way to a small cafe to wait until her afternoon appointment with Professor Carter. Over coffee, Margaret reviewed what she had learned. The family curse began with a bargain between her ancestor Ian and a mysterious painter, a being that her grandfather believed was something ancient, something that had worn many faces throughout history. This entity granted the O'Connors prosperity in exchange for capturing their essence in portraits after death. But what troubled her most was the portrait of herself that had already begun, despite the fact that she was very much alive. What did that mean for her future? Her thoughts were interrupted by a newspaper boy shouting the morning headlines. On impulse, she bought a copy of the Chicago Tribune and scanned the front page. Among the stories about the ongoing depression and political developments was a small item that made her blood run cold. Fire destroys historic mansion near Springfield. The O'Connor estate, a landmark dating back to the 1840s, was destroyed by fire late last night. The caretaker, identified as Mrs. Edith Callahan, perished in the blaze. Authorities are investigating the cause. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the article twice more. Mrs. Callahan dead. The house gone. Had the housekeeper set the fire deliberately? Was it an attempt to destroy the portraits? To break the curse once and for all? Unable to wait until afternoon, Margaret hurried to the university and made her way to Professor Carter's office. She found him surrounded by open books, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. O'Connor," he greeted her, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you until later." Wordlessly, she handed him the newspaper. He read the article, his expression grave. "I'm sorry about Mrs. Callahan," he said finally. "Did you know her well?" "She served my family for decades," Margaret replied, sinking into a chair. "She warned me about the portraits, urged me to leave. And now—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Professor Carter removed his glasses. "I've been researching your family's situation all night. What I found isn't encouraging, but there may be a way forward." He gestured to his notes. "The entity you're dealing with appears in various mythologies, a collector of souls, a keeper of memories, sometimes called the portrait thief or the face stealer." "In Ireland?" Margaret asked. "And elsewhere?" There are similar legends across Europe, always involving a bargain and always involving portraits that capture more than just a physical likeness." He leaned forward. "The good news is that such entities are bound by the terms of their agreements. They cannot take more than what was promised. But what exactly did my ancestor promise? A canvas of remembrance upon each passing, that's all we know." "Precisely. A portrait after death, not before." Professor Carter tapped his notes. "Your portrait has begun while you're still alive. That suggests the entity is breaking the terms. Or perhaps reinterpreting them." "Because I left the house?" Margaret suggested. "Possibly. Or perhaps because you're the last of the O'Connor line. With your uncle's death, you became the sole heir. If you were to die without children, the bargain would be unfulfilled," Margaret finished, understanding dawning. "There would be no more O'Connors to paint." "Exactly. I believe your unfinished portrait is an attempt to secure your essence before you can potentially escape the agreement through natural means." Margaret thought of the hotel room, the small frame that had appeared overnight. "It followed me to Chicago. The portrait, it's in my hotel room now." Professor Carter's eyes widened. "Then we must act quickly. According to the legends, once a portrait is completed, the subject's fate is sealed." "What can I do?" "You need to confront the painter directly. Challenge the terms of the agreement." He rifled through his papers. "There's a ritual described in some of the Irish accounts, a way to summon the entity and force a renegotiation." "But the house is gone," Margaret protested, "burned to the ground." "The house may be gone, but I doubt that's destroyed the entity or the portraits. These beings are tied to bloodlines as much as to places." Professor Carter wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to her. "This is an invocation in Old Irish. It translates roughly to, 'I call upon the keeper of faces to honor our bargain and show yourself.'" Margaret stared at the unfamiliar words. "Will this work?" "I can't promise anything," the professor admitted. "But the pattern in these accounts suggests that direct confrontation is your best hope. You need to establish what the original terms were exactly and determine if they've been violated." As Margaret prepared to leave, Professor Carter added one final warning. "Be careful, Mrs. O'Connor. These entities are clever and deceptive. They exist in the spaces between life and death, reality and illusion. Trust your instincts." Back at the hotel, Margaret found that her room had been cleaned, the bed made, the curtains opened to reveal a gray Chicago afternoon. The portrait still hung on the wall, but it had changed again. Now her figure was complete, seated in a chair in the hotel room, only her face remaining undefined. She sat on the edge of the bed, the professor's paper clutched in her hand, gathering her courage. Finally, as dusk began to fall, she stood before the portrait and read the invocation aloud, her voice shaking but determined. Nothing happened at first. The room remained silent, the portrait unchanged. Then slowly she became aware of a presence behind her. The temperature dropped and the light seemed to dim, though the lamps remained lit. "Margaret O'Connor," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The last of your line." She turned slowly. A tall, thin figure stood by the window, the same figure she had glimpsed in the attic mirror, the same silhouette from the small painting in her uncle's study. He wore dark clothing of no particular era, and his face shifted constantly, subtly, as if cycling through different features, never settling on one appearance. "You're the painter," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have been called that, yes." The figure moved closer, and Margaret resisted the urge to back away. "You've left your home. House is burned down. There is no home to return to." Something like surprise flickered across the painter's ever-changing features. "That changes nothing. The portraits remain. The agreement stands." "What exactly was this agreement?" Margaret demanded. "What did my ancestor promise you?" The painter's form seemed to solidify slightly. "Ian O'Connor sought fortune and security for his bloodline. I granted this in exchange for a memorial upon the death of each family member, a canvas to preserve their essence." "Then why has my portrait begun while I still live?" Margaret challenged. "That wasn't part of the bargain." The painter circled her slowly. "You are the last, Margaret O'Connor. With you, the bloodline ends. The agreement requires completion." "No," Margaret said firmly. "The agreement requires a portrait after death, not before. You're breaking the terms." The painter stopped, his face settling momentarily into a mask of displeasure. "You would challenge me? Who have watched over your family for generations, watched over, collected? What happens to the essence you capture in these portraits?" A cold smile spread across the painter's face. "It sustains me. Memory, identity, the spark of what makes each O'Connor unique, preserved forever in my gallery." Margaret felt a chill at the confirmation of her fears. "And where is this gallery now that the house is gone?" "Where it has always been," the painter replied cryptically. "What do you mean, where it has always been?" Margaret demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "The house is gone. Mrs. Callahan is dead. Where could these portraits possibly exist now?" The painter regarded her with eyes that shifted color like oil on water. "The physical house was merely a doorway. The true gallery exists in a place between. It has always been there since the moment Ian O'Connor and I sealed our arrangement." Margaret thought of the attic studio, of the unfinished portraits and the meticulous records. "Show me," she said firmly. "If what you say is true, if the bargain still holds, then show me this gallery." For a moment the painter's form flickered like a candle flame in a draught. Then he extended a hand toward her. "Very well, Margaret O'Connor. Few living souls have seen my collection. Consider it a privilege." Every instinct warned her not to touch him, but Margaret steeled herself and reached out. The moment their fingers connected, the hotel room dissolved around them. There was a sensation of falling, of being pulled through a narrow space, and then they were standing in a vast circular chamber. The gallery was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. The ceiling arched impossibly high overhead, disappearing into shadow. The walls were covered entirely with portraits, hundreds of them, far more than had ever hung in the O'Connor mansion. Some were familiar faces from the family hallway, but most were strangers, though all bore some trace of the O'Connor features. "These are all my family?" she whispered, overwhelmed by the scale. "Every O'Connor from every branch of the family across time," the painter confirmed. "Some lines died out centuries ago. Some have yet to be born." Margaret turned to him sharply. "Yet to be born? What do you mean?" The painter gestured to a section of the gallery where the portraits appeared unfinished or faded. "Time moves differently here. I see all branches of possibility, all potential futures for your bloodline." Moving closer to examine these hazy portraits, Margaret noticed something disturbing. The subjects appeared trapped, their expressions frozen in various states of distress or resignation. And unlike the portraits in the mansion, these seemed to move subtly, eyes blinking, lips trembling, as if the subjects were alive but imprisoned within their frames. "They're conscious," she gasped. "You've trapped them here." "Preserved," the painter corrected. "Protected from the ravages of time and mortality. This isn't preservation, it's imprisonment." Margaret backed away from him. This was never part of the bargain. Ian would never have agreed to this. The painter's expression hardened. "Ian O'Connor wanted wealth and security for his descendants. I provided that. In exchange, I collect what is rightfully mine upon each death." "And what of me?" Margaret challenged. "Why start my portrait while I'm still alive? That violates the terms." For the first time, the painter seemed uncomfortable. "Circumstances have changed. The fire, it was unexpected. And you, Margaret, are the last living O'Connor. With you, the direct bloodline ends. Unless I have children, she realized aloud. A possibility that grows more remote with each passing day, he replied coldly. You are 35, childless, widowed. The depression has made finding a new husband difficult. Your portrait ensures I receive what was promised, regardless of whether you continue the line. Margaret looked around the gallery again, her mind racing. Among the completed portraits, she recognized her parents, grandparents, and more distant relatives. Their eyes seemed to follow her, pleading. If the bargain was for prosperity in exchange for portraits after death, then you've already been compensated for these, she said, gesturing to the completed works. The O'Connors have lived well for generations. Indeed, the painter agreed. But the bargain doesn't entitle you to capture me before my time, nor does it give you the right to imprison their consciousness within these portraits. The painter's form wavered slightly. You misunderstand the nature of our arrangement. I do not merely paint likenesses. I capture essence, the spark of identity that makes each O'Connor unique. That was implicit in the terms. No, Margaret said firmly, it wasn't. And I believe you know that, which is why you've tried to hide this gallery from the living. You've been taking more than was agreed upon. For a long moment, the painter was silent, his ever-shifting features unreadable. Then he moved to a blank section of wall where a single frame hung. Within it was her unfinished portrait, now showing her seated in the hotel room, her face still a blank oval. What would you propose, Margaret O'Connor? He finally asked. The bargain cannot be undone. What's been given cannot be taken back. Margaret thought carefully before answering. Professor Carter had warned her that these entities were bound by their agreements, but were deceptive and dangerous. She needed to find a solution that honored the original terms without surrendering herself or her family to this eternal prison. A renegotiation, she said at last. The original bargain promised you a memorial upon each death, a remembrance, not a soul. You've taken far more than was agreed. In exchange for releasing the consciousness of my family members and allowing them to pass on naturally, I will ensure the O'Connor line continues. The painter tilted his head, intrigued. And how would you guarantee this? You have no husband, no children. I will adopt, Margaret declared. A child who will carry the O'Connor name and inherit the family fortune, what remains of it. The bloodline will continue, and you will receive your portraits after death, as originally agreed. But they will be true memorials, not prisons. Adoption? The painter seemed to consider this. The child would not carry O'Connor blood. The bargain was with the O'Connor name, not the blood, Margaret countered. Ian sought prosperity for his descendants, those who would carry on his legacy. An adopted child would be my legal heir, my descendant in the eyes of the law. The painter circled her slowly, his form shifting more rapidly now, as if agitated. And if I refuse? Margaret gestured to the burned remains of her portrait. Then you get nothing more. The house is gone. I am the last O'Connor, and I will die childless and nameless if necessary, ending the line completely. Your bargain will be broken. It was a gamble. Margaret had no way of knowing if the painter could simply take her by force, complete her portrait against her will. But something in his reaction told her she had struck a nerve. These entities valued their bargains. Breaking one might have consequences even they feared. Finally, the painter stopped before her. I will consider your proposal. But know this, Margaret O'Connor, if you attempt to cheat me, to escape our arrangement through deception, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, but for any child you bring into the O'Connor name. I understand, Margaret said, meeting his shifting gaze steadily, but my terms are non-negotiable. Release my family's consciousness from these portraits, allow them to pass on naturally, and limit future portraits to true memorials after death. In exchange, I will ensure the O'Connor name continues. The gallery around them began to flicker, the portraits fading in and out of visibility. The painter's form grew less distinct, merging with the shadows. We will speak again, Margaret O'Connor. His voice echoed as the gallery dissolved around her. Soon, Margaret found herself back in her hotel room, alone. The portrait on the wall remained unfinished, but something had changed. The canvas seemed less substantial somehow, as if losing its hold on reality. She sank onto the bed, exhausted but determined. She had challenged the painter, questioned the terms of a bargain made nearly a century ago. Now she needed to find a way to fulfill her part of the proposed new arrangement to continue the O'Connor line through adoption, ensuring the bargain could be maintained without condemning her family to eternal imprisonment. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Margaret thought she heard whispers from the portrait on the wall, the voices of O'Connor's past, urging her forward, guiding her toward a solution that might free them all. The next morning dawned gray and cold, but Margaret felt a new sense of purpose. After a quick breakfast, she telephoned Professor Carter to report what had happened. "You actually saw this ... gallery?" the professor asked, his academic curiosity evident even through the telephone line. "And you challenged the terms of the agreement?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. The painter seemed unsettled by my proposal. "I think I've bought some time at least." "Remarkable," Professor Carter murmured. "In the folklore, few ever see the collector's true domain and return to tell of it. You've accomplished something significant, Mrs. O'Connor." "But I'm not free yet," Margaret reminded him. "I still need to ensure the O'Connor name continues, and I need to return to Springfield to see what remains of the estate. Do you think that's wise? After what happened to Mrs. Callahan... "I have to go back," Margaret insisted. "Whatever caused the fire, I need to face it, and I need to begin making arrangements for adoption if possible." Professor Carter was silent for a moment. The economic situation makes adoption complicated these days. There are many orphaned and abandoned children, but the legal systems are overwhelmed. It may take time. "Time is something I may not have much of," Margaret replied, glancing at the unfinished portrait. "But I have to try." After saying goodbye to the professor, who promised to continue researching her situation, Margaret packed her few belongings and checked out of the hotel. The portrait on the wall faded as she watched, becoming insubstantial until it disappeared entirely. She took this as a positive sign. Perhaps the painter was indeed considering her proposal. The train journey back to Springfield was somber. Margaret found herself thinking of Mrs. Callahan, wondering if the housekeeper had sacrificed herself deliberately to destroy the house and the portraits within it. Had she known something about breaking the curse? Or had she simply been trying to protect Margaret from a fate she had witnessed befalling other O'Connors? Springfield was a small city, and news of the O'Connor mansion fire had spread quickly. When Margaret arrived at her local bank to access her accounts, the manager expressed his condolences. "A terrible tragedy, Mrs. O'Connor. The house was a historic landmark. Will you be rebuilding?" "I'm not certain yet," Margaret replied truthfully. "I need to assess what remains first." With funds secured, she hired a car to take her to the estate. As they drove through the bare winter landscape, Margaret prepared herself for what she might find. Would there be anything left of the mansion at all? And more importantly, would the painter be waiting for her? The driver slowed as they approached the property. Where the grand O'Connor mansion had once stood was now a blackened shell. The stone foundation remained, along with portions of the exterior walls, but the interior was completely gutted. Ash and debris littered what had been the front lawn. "Wait here, please," Margaret instructed the driver as she stepped out of the car. The air still smelled of smoke as she picked her way carefully through the ruins. Most of the first floor had collapsed into the cellar, but part of the main staircase remained, leading nowhere. Margaret stood in what had been the entrance hall, trying to orient herself. The portrait gallery would have been to her right, but nothing remained of it now except charred wall fragments. Something glinted amid the ashes near her feet. Bending down, Margaret discovered a small brass key, the one that had unlocked the attic door. She picked it up, oddly comforted by this tangible connection to the house as it had been. "You have returned," said a familiar voice behind her. Margaret turned to find the painter standing amidst the ruins, his form more solid than it had been in the gallery, though his features still shifted subtly. "I needed to see it for myself," she replied, pocketing the key. "Did you cause this? The fire?" "No." The painter gestured to the destruction around them. "This was human doing. You're Mrs. Callahan, I believe, though her motives remain unclear to me." "She was trying to protect me," Margaret said with certainty. She knew what the portraits really were. Perhaps. The painter moved closer, his feet leaving no impression in the ash-covered ground. "I have considered your proposal, Margaret O'Connor. A renegotiation is ... possible." Hope flickered in Margaret's chest. "You'll release my family?" "Not so quickly," the painter cautioned. "The terms must be precise. I will agree to modify our arrangement as follows. The consciousness of your ancestors will be released from their portraits, allowing them to pass on naturally. Future portraits will serve as true memorials only, capturing likeness but not essence. And in exchange?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "You will continue the O'Connor line through legal adoption, ensuring that the family name endures for at least 3 more generations. The adopted children and their descendants will be subject to the same arrangement, a portrait after death, but one that captures only memory, not soul." Margaret considered this carefully. "And my own portrait, the one you've already begun?" "It will remain unfinished until your natural death," the painter replied. "At which point it will be completed according to the new terms." It seemed too simple, too easy. Margaret searched for the catch, the hidden clause that might trap her or her future adopted child. How do I know you'll honor these new terms? That you won't simply continue imprisoning my family once I'm gone? The painter's expression was unreadable. Bargains such as ours are binding in ways humans cannot fully comprehend. I am as bound by them as you are. Break your word, and the consequences will be severe. The same applies to me. Margaret wasn't entirely convinced, but she sensed this was the best offer she was likely to receive. Very well, she said finally, I accept these terms. I will adopt a child to carry on the O'Connor name, and you will release my ancestors and limit future portraits to true memorials only. The painter extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret took it, sealing their renegotiated bargain. The moment their hands touched, a wind seemed to sweep through the ruins, carrying away ash and dust. Margaret thought she heard distant voices, whispers of relief, of gratitude, of release. When she blinked, the painter was gone. She stood alone among the ruins of her family home, the brass key warm in her pocket. The driver called to her from the car, concerned by her long silence. Mrs. O'Connor, are you all right? Yes, she called back, surprised to find that she meant it. I'm ready to go now. As the car pulled away from the property, Margaret looked back one last time. For a moment she thought she saw figures standing amid the ruins, transparent shapes that might have been her parents. Her uncle, generations of O'Connors now freed from their painted prisons. They raised their hands in farewell before fading into the winter light. Margaret turned her face forward toward Springfield and the future. She had a new purpose now, to find a child who needed a home. To continue the O'Connor name not for the sake of a supernatural bargain, but for the sake of giving that child the security and prosperity that Ian O'Connor had sought for his descendants. The portrait might still hang in some otherworldly gallery when her time eventually came, but it would be just that, a portrait, a memory, not a prison. And the child she would adopt would face the same fate, but with full knowledge and understanding of the arrangement. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, a new chapter for the O'Connor legacy. Spring arrived in Illinois, bringing with it new growth and possibility. In the 3 months since the fire, Margaret had established herself in a modest but comfortable house in Springfield. The insurance payment for the destroyed mansion, combined with her inheritance from Uncle Seamus, provided her with financial security despite the ongoing depression. True to her word, Margaret had begun the process of adoption. It proved more challenging than she had anticipated, not because of a lack of children needing homes, but because of the bureaucratic complications and social prejudices against single women adopting. The social workers questioned her motives, her ability to provide, her lack of a husband. A child needs a father figure, one particularly stern caseworker had informed her. And at your age, Mrs. O'Connor, wouldn't you rather focus on finding a new husband instead? Margaret had bitten back her frustration and explained patiently that she had a substantial income, a spacious home, and a genuine desire to provide for a child who needed care. She didn't mention that she was also fulfilling a supernatural bargain with an entity that had been collecting her family's souls for generations. Today she was meeting with Mr. Reynolds, a lawyer specializing in adoption cases. His office was cluttered but organized, with files stacked neatly on every available surface. Mrs. O'Connor, he greeted her, rising from behind his desk. I've reviewed your case, and I believe I may have some good news. Margaret sat down, trying not to appear too eager. You've found a potential match? Several, actually. Mr. Reynolds opened a folder. The orphanages are overcrowded, especially with families unable to care for their children during these hard times. Your financial situation makes you an attractive candidate, despite the unusual circumstances. By unusual circumstances, Margaret knew he meant her status as a childless widow seeking to adopt on her own. But she had made progress in recent weeks, impressing the authorities with her determination and resources. There's a brother and sister, ages 8 and 6, Mr. Reynolds continued. Their parents died in a factory accident last year. Or there's a 10-year-old boy whose family lost their farm. Bright lad, according to the reports. Margaret listened as he described several other children, each with their own heartbreaking story. The depression had created so much suffering, so many broken families. Could I meet them? She asked when he had finished. Before making any decisions? Mr. Reynolds nodded. I've arranged for you to visit the Springfield Children's Home tomorrow. 3 of the children I mentioned are there. The others are in foster situations, but could be brought in if you're interested. As Margaret left the lawyer's office, she felt both hope and trepidation. She was committed to providing a good home for a child who needed one. But the knowledge that she was also fulfilling a supernatural bargain weighed on her. Would it be fair to bring a child into the O'Connor name, knowing what it entailed? Then again, the new terms of the agreement meant that the child would face only a memorial portrait after death, not imprisonment. Compared to the hardships many orphan children were facing in the Depression, it seemed a small price to pay for security, education, and a loving home. Back at her house, Margaret was surprised to find a package waiting on her doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper with no return address, only her name written in an elegant, old-fashioned script. Inside, she found a small portrait in an ornate frame, not one of the O'Connor portraits, but a landscape showing the mansion as it had once stood, bathed in summer sunlight. In the corner was a signature, a symbol that resembled both a letter and a brushstroke. A note accompanied the painting, a reminder of what was, and what may be again. The foundation remains. Build wisely, Margaret O'Connor. She recognized the painter's hand in both the artwork and the message. Was it a threat, a warning, or perhaps, in its way, a blessing on her efforts to continue the family line? Margaret placed the landscape on her mantel, a reminder of both what she had lost and what she had gained through her confrontation with the painter. The portrait of herself remained unfinished in whatever realm the painter occupied, waiting for her natural end. In the meantime, she had a life to live, and hopefully soon, a child to raise. The next day, Margaret visited the Springfield Children's Home. The building was clean but austere, its hallways echoing with the sounds of children at play. The matron, Mrs. Perkins, led her through the facility, explaining their programs and challenges. Most of the children have lost their parents to illness, accidents, or simply abandonment, Mrs. Perkins explained. We do our best, but there are so many, and resources are limited. In a classroom, Margaret observed several children engaged in lessons. Her attention was drawn to a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, sitting slightly apart from the others. Unlike her peers, who were focused on their work, this child was sketching intently in a notebook. "Who is that?" Margaret asked quietly. Mrs. Perkins followed her gaze. "That's Charlotte. She came to us 6 months ago after losing both parents to influenza. Bright child, but withdrawn. Hardly speaks, but she's always drawing." Something about the girl called to Margaret. "May I speak with her?" Mrs. Perkins hesitated. "She's not one of the children on your list. And I should warn you, she's been ... difficult to place. Prospective parents find her silence unnerving." "Nevertheless," Margaret insisted gently. They waited until the lesson ended, and then Mrs. Perkins called Charlotte over. The girl approached cautiously, her notebook clutched protectively against her chest. "Charlotte, this is Mrs. O'Connor. She'd like to talk with you for a few minutes." The child regarded Margaret with solemn eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She didn't speak, but she didn't move away either. "Hello, Charlotte," Margaret said, kneeling to the girl's level. "Mrs. Perkins tells me you like to draw. May I see some of your work?" After a moment's hesitation, Charlotte opened her notebook. The pages were filled with detailed sketches, far more advanced than one would expect from a child her age. There were scenes of the orphanage, portraits of other children and staff, and landscapes, presumably from memory. "These are wonderful," Margaret said sincerely. "You have a real talent." Charlotte didn't smile, but her posture relaxed slightly. She turned to a new page and quickly sketched a simple portrait of Margaret, capturing her essence in just a few lines. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. There was something familiar in the way the child rendered her features, something that reminded her of the portraits in the O'Connor mansion. "Thank you," she said, accepting the drawing. "That's very good. Have you always loved art?" Charlotte nodded, and then, surprising both Margaret and Mrs. Perkins, she spoke in a soft voice. "My father taught me. He was a painter." It was the first personal information the girl had volunteered since arriving at the orphanage. According to Mrs. Perkins's wide-eyed reaction, Margaret felt a strange connection to this quiet, artistic child who had lost everything, just as she herself had. Over the next few weeks, Margaret visited Charlotte regularly, slowly building trust. She learned that the girl's parents had both been artists who had struggled to find work during the Depression. Her father had taken odd jobs painting portraits for wealthy families, traveling from town to town, before illness claimed both him and his wife. The more time Margaret spent with Charlotte, the more certain she became that this was the child meant to continue the O'Connor line. There was something fitting about adopting a child with artistic talent into a family defined by portraits. The adoption process moved forward, surprisingly smoothly after Margaret's initial difficulties. Perhaps the painter was exerting some influence, clearing obstacles to ensure the continuation of their bargain. By summer, the paperwork was finalized, and Charlotte came to live in Margaret's home as Charlotte O'Connor. The first few months were an adjustment for both of them. Charlotte remained quiet and somewhat withdrawn, though she seemed content in her new surroundings. Margaret provided her with quality art supplies and encouraged her talent, enrolling her in classes with a respected local artist. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies illuminate the garden, Charlotte asked a question that caught Margaret off guard. "Why did you choose me? There were other children who talked more." Margaret considered how to answer truthfully without revealing too much. I felt a connection to you, she said finally. We both lost our families, and we both understand the power of images, of art. Charlotte seemed satisfied with this answer. After a moment, she added, I dream about them sometimes. My parents, they're in paintings, watching me. Is that strange? Margaret's breath caught. No, she said carefully. I don't think that's strange at all. Art is a way of preserving memories, keeping people with us even after they're gone. Charlotte nodded solemnly. The man in my dreams says the same thing. The one with the changing face. Margaret froze. What man, Charlotte? He comes in my dreams sometimes. He says he knew my father. He says I'll be a great artist someday, like him. Charlotte looked up at Margaret with innocent eyes. Do you think that's true? Margaret put her arm around the child's shoulders, pulling her close. I think you'll be whatever you want to be. But Charlotte, if this man appears in your dreams again, will you tell me? Okay, Charlotte agreed easily. Can I have some lemonade? As the child went inside, Margaret remained on the porch, troubled by this revelation. Had the painter already made contact with Charlotte? Was he grooming her in some way? Or was it simply a child's dream influenced by her artistic nature and the trauma of losing her parents? Either way, Margaret was more determined than ever to protect her adopted daughter. She had fulfilled her part of the bargain by continuing the O'Connor name, but she wouldn't allow the painter to manipulate Charlotte or draw her into the supernatural arrangement without her knowledge and consent. As darkness fell completely, Margaret thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of her property, a tall, thin silhouette watching the house. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the dancing lights of fireflies in the summer night. Inside, Charlotte was setting up her easel in the living room, preparing to capture the view from the window. Margaret watched her for a moment, this child who had so unexpectedly become the next generation of O'Connors, who would carry on a name and a legacy that stretched back to Ireland and forward into an uncertain future. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And when the time eventually came for Margaret's portrait to be completed, she would ensure that Charlotte understood the true nature of their family's unusual relationship with art, memory, and mortality. 5 years passed, transforming both Margaret and Charlotte's lives. The worst of the Depression had begun to ease, though the country now faced the growing threat of war in Europe. Springfield had changed too, expanding and modernizing despite the economic challenges. Charlotte, now 12, had blossomed under Margaret's care, no longer the silent, withdrawn child from the orphanage. She had developed into a confident, thoughtful girl whose artistic talent continued to impress everyone who saw her work. She attended the local school, where she excelled academically while maintaining a small but loyal circle of friends. Margaret had used part of her inheritance to establish a modest art gallery in downtown Springfield, showcasing local artists and providing Charlotte with exposure to different styles and techniques. The gallery had become unexpectedly successful, a bright spot in the community during difficult times. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret was reviewing the gallery's accounts when Charlotte burst through the door, school satchel bouncing against her hip, her face alight with excitement. Mom, Mr. Harrington says my painting is going to be in the state exhibition, the youngest artist ever selected. Margaret looked up with a smile, her heart warming at being called Mom, a title Charlotte had adopted naturally about a year after coming to live with her. That's wonderful news. Which painting? The one of the old mansion, Charlotte replied, pulling off her coat. The one I dreamed about. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. The painting Charlotte referred to was an unsettling piece she had created several months ago, a detailed rendering of the O'Connor mansion as it had stood before the fire, though Charlotte had never seen it intact. When questioned about her inspiration, Charlotte had simply said it came to her in a dream, perfect in every detail. That's quite an honor, Margaret said carefully. Mr. Harrington has excellent taste. Charlotte didn't seem to notice her discomfort. He says there might even be a scholarship opportunity if the exhibition committee likes my work. Can you imagine? Professional training in Chicago or maybe even New York someday? Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Margaret cautioned, though she was proud of Charlotte's accomplishment. The exhibition is still months away. Now do you have homework? As Charlotte headed upstairs to her room, Margaret remained at her desk, troubled. Over the years, there had been several incidents that suggested the painter's continued interest in Charlotte, the dreams of the mansion she'd never seen. Occasional mentions of the man with the changing face who offered artistic advice in her sleep, and most disturbingly, Charlotte's uncanny ability to create portraits that captured not just the physical likeness of her subjects, but something of their essence as well. Margaret had debated whether to tell Charlotte about the O'Connor legacy, about the bargain that had been struck so long ago. She had always planned to do so eventually when Charlotte was old enough to understand, but she had hesitated, not wanting to burden the child with such strange knowledge. Now, with Charlotte's talent gaining recognition, Margaret wondered if she had waited too long. Was the painter influencing her adopted daughter, guiding her artistic development for his own purposes? Or was Charlotte's talent simply a natural gift, a coincidence that had led her to the one family that might truly appreciate its significance? That evening after dinner, Margaret made a decision. "Charlotte, there's something important I'd like to discuss with you. About our family." Charlotte looked up from her sketchbook, curious. "What about it?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I've told you that I adopted you because I had no children of my own, and that the O'Connor name would have ended with me. But there's more to the story, history that you should know now that you're old enough to understand." Over the next hour, Margaret explained everything: Ian O'Connor's bargain with the painter, the portraits that appeared after deaths, her discovery of the attic studio and the otherworldly gallery, and finally her renegotiation of the terms that had led to Charlotte's adoption. Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief to a kind of wondering acceptance. When Margaret finished, the girl was silent for a long moment. "You think he's real, don't you?" Charlotte finally said. "The man in my dreams, the painter." Margaret nodded. "I believe he's taken an interest in you, yes. Perhaps because of your natural talent, or perhaps because you're now part of the O'Connor line. And these portraits, they used to trap people's souls, but now they don't?" "That's part of the new arrangement," Margaret confirmed. "The portraits still appear after death, but they're just memorials now, not prisons. At least that's what was promised to me." Charlotte set aside her sketchbook and moved to sit beside Margaret on the sofa. "Is that why you adopted me? Just to keep this bargain?" "No," Margaret said firmly, putting an arm around her. "That was part of it, yes. But from the moment I met you, I knew you were meant to be my daughter. The bargain may have led me to adoption, but it didn't determine who I chose to love." Charlotte leaned against her, processing everything she had learned. "So someday after we die, our portraits will appear somewhere. And if I have children and they have children, this will keep happening. For at least 3 generations, according to the terms I agreed to," Margaret said. "After that, I don't know. Perhaps the bargain will be considered fulfilled. Can I see them? The portraits that already exist?" Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure. The mansion is gone, and with it the physical gallery. The painter showed me another gallery, a place between, as he called it, but I didn't know how to access it on my own." Charlotte was quiet again, thinking. Then she looked up with unexpected determination in her eyes. "I want to see it, and I want to meet him, the painter. If I'm part of this now, I should understand it completely. Charlotte, I don't think that's wise. The painter is ... not human. He's dangerous in ways we can't fully comprehend." "But he's interested in me already, isn't he, in my art?" Charlotte persisted. "You said he appears in dreams. Maybe I can ask him there." Margaret felt a surge of protectiveness. "Absolutely not. I didn't tell you this so you could seek him out. I told you so you would be prepared, so you would understand our family's unusual history." Charlotte didn't argue further, but Margaret recognized the thoughtful look in her eyes, the same expression she wore when facing an artistic challenge, considering angles and approaches. That night, after Charlotte had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone in the living room, wondering if she had made a mistake in revealing everything. She had hoped the knowledge would help Charlotte recognize and resist the painter's influence. But what if it had the opposite effect? What if it intrigued her, drew her closer to the entity that had haunted the O'Connor family for generations? A sound from upstairs startled her, a thump, followed by silence. Margaret listened intently, then rose and climbed the stairs to Charlotte's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open carefully. Charlotte lay in bed, apparently asleep, but something was different about the room. Margaret scanned the space and realized what had changed. A new painting stood on Charlotte's easel, one that hadn't been there earlier. Moving closer, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. It was a portrait of the painter himself, more clearly rendered than Margaret had ever seen him. His features, while still suggesting the capacity to shift and change, were temporarily fixed in an expression of curious assessment. He stood in what appeared to be the gallery Margaret had visited, the circular chamber with its hundreds of portraits. Below the portrait, in Charlotte's neat handwriting, was a simple caption: "He says it's time we met properly." Margaret moved quickly to Charlotte's bedside and gently shook her awake. "Charlotte? Charlotte, wake up." The girl stirred slowly, her eyes unfocused as if returning from a great distance. "Mom? What's wrong?" "The painting," Margaret said, pointing to the easel. "When did you do this?" Charlotte sat up, looking confused. "What painting? I didn't." Her voice trailed off as she saw the portrait of the painter. "I don't remember doing that." A chill ran through Margaret. "You must have been sleepwalking. Or, he guided my hand," Charlotte finished, a mix of fear and fascination in her voice. "While I was dreaming." Margaret moved to the easel and turned the portrait to face the wall. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's trying to establish a connection with you. But why? What does he want from me?" "I don't know, Margaret.